Not being raised in the United States, I didn't learn about the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. until I was in college. See, I'd grown up in South Africa in the waning years of apartheid. Apartheid, that racial segregation system on steroids. It was a system of white racial privilege that infected all of life and that only began to be dismantled in the 1990s, just after I left. I'd spent my college years trying to understand why I grew up knowing so little about the racial injustices all around me. I realized that the church that I grew up in rarely talked about racial oppression, how few Christians I knew would admit to their racial bias or even talk about race, let alone the silence there was, particularly amongst evangelical Christians, about racial injustice. And I met the writings of the Reverend Martin Luther King Jr. Hear this segment from his letter from a Birmingham jail. He was arrested in 1963, and he wrote this letter in particular to Christian clergy, to Christian leaders. He said, "When I was suddenly catapulted into the leadership of the bus protest in Montgomery, Alabama a few years ago, I felt we would be supported by the white church. I felt that the white ministers, priests, and rabbis of the South would be among our strongest allies. Instead, some have been outright opponents, refusing to understand the freedom movement and misrepresenting its leaders. All too many others have been more cautious than courageous and have remained silent behind the anesthetizing security of stained glass windows." Christians, white Christians in particular, we were on the wrong side of history with apartheid. Wrong side of history in the civil rights movement. And now again with Black Lives Matter. To my fellow white Christians, wouldn't you rather participate in the justice and reconciliation of God and be part of that beloved community that Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. preached about?